You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Robin Erickson, and I'm a Vice President in the Human Capital Center at the Conference Board. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights, the Reimagined Workplace 2 years later, where my co-author and distinguished Principal Research Fellow Deb Cohen and I will be discussing the fourth report in our Reimagined Workplace series. The Conference Board was one of the first organizations to track human capital responses to COVID-19 in April of 2020 during the very early stages of the pandemic in the US. By the summer of 2020, we realized that the pandemic was not going to be a short-lived crisis and conducted a follow-up survey in September. We published the Adapting to the Reimagined Workplace in October. Then, since COVID still hadn't gone away, we published the Reimagined Workplace a year later in May of 2021. And sadly now, 2 years later, with COVID-19 variants still continuing to appear, we continued our research on the long-term impacts of the pandemic on both the workforce and the workplace. Hi, Deb, and thank you for joining the podcast today. Please start us off by telling our audience what we anticipate the future workplace to look like.
Well, thank you, Robin. And as always, I appreciate the warm welcome. And I certainly love doing research with you and having this conversation. So as we start talking about this fourth survey in the Reimagined Workplace series, we believe that there will be significantly more remote and hybrid work after COVID-19. We also anticipate that organizations will adapt to this new work reality and flexible hours and hybrid working locations, really hoping that these adjustments will sustain future success in sourcing talent, retaining current employees, and increasing productivity levels.
Well, given that the Great Resignation is still going strong, I do believe that we've captured our audience's attention when we talk about sourcing talent and retaining talent. But before we dive into the details of our report, would you briefly mention the study methodology?
Of course. So in March of 2022, we conducted an online survey and we had responses from 179 human capital executives, mostly from multinational companies that were headquartered here in the US. Now, for those of you that go in and download the report, and I hope you'll do, in several parts of the report, you're going to see that we compare previous survey results to our current survey results. Responses to some of these questions were analyzed separately for two types of organizations. The first type encompasses those organizations that are primarily professional and office workers, and the second type consists of those organizations with primarily industry and manual services workers. We also have more detailed information regarding the survey demographics in the publication. So for folks who are interested in learning more, please go and download that report. Now, let's go ahead and get started, Robin, with the key insights from the report.
Thanks, Deb. So we extracted 5 insights from our research. And the first finding is that hybrid work is here to stay and will be one of the most significant organizational legacies of COVID-19. From our very first survey, we had predicted that a lasting repercussion of the pandemic would be remote work. And it's not that remote work is new. I've actually been working remotely for over 15 years. But we believe that its usage will become widespread and endemic, much like the pandemic. Nearly 45% of the respondents said that they expect 40% or more of their employees will work primarily remotely a year after the pandemic ends. That's a pretty big number because at the start of the pandemic, less than 20% of respondents thought that the majority of their workforce would work virtually remotely 3 days or more a week. Over the 2 years and 4 repetitions of the survey, the expectation has more than doubled with a steady trajectory upward. And as Deb mentioned, if you're interested in seeing the chart, it's definitely a very steady upward trajectory in the chart. And this development's important not only because remote work has proven successful through our analysis, but also its prevalence means a fundamental shift in the way that work is done, by whom, where, and when, which is going to lead to adjusted practices, as well as shifts in the employee-employer relationship. So Deb, why don't you talk to us about the impact of this reimagined workplace with more hybrid work?
Of course, Robin, thank you. So the next insight from the research is that with perceived productivity remaining high, 90%, and that was the biggest number in the survey, of organizations are now allowing hybrid work, which means part remote and part in the office, and 2/3 are allowing flexible work hours. The shift to hybrid work is becoming very real as more and more employees and job applicants are demanding it. 45% required some of their employees to return to the office workplace full-time, but only 4%, which was the smallest number in the survey, required all of their workers to return full-time. So this might reflect a recognition by a majority of organizations that, one, work they had previously thought needed to be accomplished on-site could in fact be accomplished off-site, and two, it's important to respect ongoing employee concerns about returning to the workplace. So this next point is important because the preference is important to understand for several reasons. And that includes its impact on productivity and organizational culture. As more workers are seeking flexible, if not fully remote, location options, many organizations looking to remain competitive have altered their policies to better attract candidates and retain current talent. So this is interesting because only 46% of organizations have trained employees to work more effectively remotely, while 58% have trained managers and supervisors to lead more effectively. And Robin, you know that training is one of my, big focuses, and I believe that these numbers really have to increase, that organizations are going to need to spend more time training employees and managers for working remotely. So in this survey series, we found that self-reported productivity has remained high in the last 18 months. And the big question is whether work flexibility that has led to this higher productivity can be sustained as organizations shift policies to adjust how work is structured. Now, additional survey analysis completed by the Conference Board shows that productivity increases were higher for those organizations whose employees were working primarily virtually or remotely. That was 62%, compared to organizations whose employees were not working primarily virtually at 47%. Now, this long-term impact of hybrid work on organizational culture certainly remains to be seen. Robin, this morning I read a new study that came out of Northwestern and Princeton universities, and the study says that U.S. economic productivity during the pandemic was driven entirely by companies with remote work capacity. And what that says to me is that organizations who were prepared with the ability to work remotely really contributed more toward productivity. So the silver lining in this pandemic may be that organizations are now better prepared in case they need to work remotely should, something unfortunate like the pandemic either continue or return in some fashion.
So Deb, I just agree with that. I mean, I live in Chicago, and before the lockdown back in 2020, we actually saw people walking to the train station carrying their hard drives because they didn't have laptops and they wanted to be able to work from home. And so that was clearly not all organizations were ready, but I do believe, they didn't have the infrastructure for their computer networks. They did not have laptops. We all know the issues with the supply chains. So I do believe now that we are better prepared if and when we have to lock down again for the next crisis that's around the corner.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's a really interesting study. You'll have to send it to me. So I'm going to talk about our third insight, which is around the recruitment and retention of workers, which has become even more challenging in the last 12 months. And we know this because we asked the same question back in our April of 2021 survey. And basically, finding, hiring, and retaining workers is a difficult challenge for all organizations right now. And so in April of 2021, we asked, in general, how difficult is it for your organization to find talent? And for those organizations with mostly professional and office workers, 60% said it was difficult. However, that number jumped to 84% a year later for those organizations with mostly professional and office support workers. In terms of the workers from those organizations with mostly industry and manual services workers, in April of 2021, it was 80% found it difficult to find workers. And it was a very small difference in March of 2022 of 81%. So it's that level of difficulty has basically remained the same for a year. So, but you can definitely see sort of, the fact that employees are resigning and going someplace else, and it's making it hard for organizations to find talent, has definitely become a bigger issue for those organizations with mostly professional and office workers. Related to that is retention. So we asked the question a year ago, and how difficult is it for your organization to retain workers? And so for those organizations that had mostly professional and office workers, only 28% a year ago said it was difficult to retain workers. Well, that number has jumped more than doubled to 64% in March of 2022. Really big increase. And as Deb had mentioned earlier, with our biggest number in the survey and our smallest numbers in the survey, researchers love big numbers, little numbers, big jumps, because we can basically, we can have an insight from what's happening there. So clearly, it's become more than twice as difficult to retain workers for those organizations with mostly professional and office employees. Guess what? In those organizations with mostly industry and manual workers, a year ago, almost 50%, 49% in April of 2021 said it was difficult to retain workers. But a year later, in March of 2022, that number had gone up as well, up to 73%. So clearly, retaining workers is very difficult, as well as finding them. And so, as Deb had just been talking about, there has been an increased productivity, and we know that the difficulty of recruiting new employees is adding stress to the talent acquisition process. At one point last year, the number one job that was posted was for recruiters, because organizations just didn't have enough recruiters to fill all of these empty positions. But then there's also increased pressure on talent management to retain existing workers. And according to another recent survey from the Conference Board, to address these worsening labor shortages, organizations are attracting candidates by offering starting and sign-on bonuses, increasing the transparency of salary information and job ads, lowering the educational requirements, and looking for alternative credentials, something that Deb and I wrote a report on, and then offering more initial job training. So clearly, organizations are becoming more flexible in their hiring patterns today than they were before the pandemic. And one of the potential solution to these hiring difficulties is to expand recruitment efforts to workers who work predominantly virtually. And before the pandemic, 46% of surveyed human capital leaders indicated that their organizations were not willing to hire virtual employees at all. And only 8% were willing to hire virtual employees in the US or globally. Now, 49% are willing to hire 100% virtually. And that's a six-fold increase. Again, another really big jump, and just shows sort of what's been happening with work, remote work, specifically hybrid work during the pandemic. So Deb, why don't you walk us through the last two insights on employee well-being and organizational culture?
Of course, Robin. And of course, these are two very important issues that you have to combine with the previous insights as well. So employee well-being has unfortunately continued to deteriorate. Since September of 2020, the survey human capital leaders have been reporting that the number of employees who are seeking support for mental health, the number of employees identifying as burned out, the number of hours worked, and the usage of employee assistance plans have all increased since the start of the pandemic. On the flip side of that, though, levels of employee engagement and morale and the number of vacation days used have both decreased. So you've got a bit of a conundrum there that you need to work out if you're in organizations today trying to figure out the balance between productivity and engagement and employee well-being. But the reality is that the need to address the entire employee experience remains strong. Human capital leaders report an almost doubled number of employees who identified as being burned out in 18 months, from 42% in September of 2020 to 77% in March of 2022. With more hybrid work predicted, in order to improve well-being, we suggest that organizations help employees find ways to create boundaries that both bridge and separate personal and professional responsibilities. The key seems to be really to encourage employees to create work-life integration scenarios that are best for them. And the reality is that it's going to differ from employee to employee, which makes it more difficult for both managers and organizations. But closely tied to employee experience is organizational culture. Now, in April of 2021, we asked whether or not organizational culture had changed in the year since COVID began. And 49% said that it had. So almost 50% is a really large number, and partly because it takes, as you know, Robin, 2 or 3 years and maybe even more for culture transformation to occur. So in March of 2022, when we asked the same question and 64% responded that their culture had changed since COVID began, that to us said that organization culture is changing more rapidly as a result of some of the things that organizations are experiencing. And in fact, that leads us to our final and fifth insight from the report. Most surveyed human capital leaders think elements of their organization cultures have changed for the better since the outbreak of the pandemic. We then asked in this survey about 11 elements of organizational culture and found that collaborative technology, genuine caring by managers, transparent communications by leaders, and commitment to corporate social responsibility have changed for the better at over 70% of surveyed organizations. However, on the downside of that, the level of trust between leaders and employees has changed for the worse at 25% of organizations, possibly indicating that deteriorating employee well-being has taken a toll. So we see lots of good news there, in terms of changes for the better, but there's also some things to watch, particularly in this current climate of, sort of organizational upheaval with economic strains that are continuing.
I also think that many employees are feeling pressure from their leadership to return to the workplace. And I think perhaps some of that decreasing trust is because they feel like they're not being heard. And so what we're seeing is that whenever they can, employees are voting with their feet and they're finding jobs that actually meet their flexibility requirements. And I think that might be one of the reasons for that growing lack of trust.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Robin. And it will be interesting to see how things play out in terms of whether or not hiring continues at the pace it had been, or if it slows as a result of economic issues, and then what impact that may have on some of these things. So, Robin, change in organization culture typically occurs slowly and deliberately, as we said earlier, and only when behaviors change across organization. And this typically occurs when values and beliefs change and is most often facilitated by organizational leadership. And therein lies that discussion about trust and other important issues in the organization. So the pandemic has caused an immediate and substantial change in both behaviors and beliefs for leaders and employees. And we think that leaders should consider if and how their culture has changed to determine if it still aligns with their organizational purpose and values. Lots of things to unpack here, but it concludes the key insights from the report. And Robin, I'll turn it over to you for some concluding thoughts.
Well, thank you, Deb, and thank you again for joining me both with the research and on our podcast today. There's no doubt that workplace culture, employee well-being, recruitment, and retention have undergone significant transformation in the last 2 years. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how many people start to do PhD theses on the changes in the workplace. But I hope all of our respondents have enjoyed today's podcast. Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a better idea of how organizations can create a productive and sustainable work environment for their employees. If you would like to find out more about our different research, please do download the report. But you can also visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts or /webcasts for more interactive programs. You can also find our podcasts on other platforms that you may be listening to, like iTunes or Spotify. Thanks again, and have a great day.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.